Hello, and welcome to the Daily Climate Show. Coming up today, the fight over fossil fuels. Campaigners are already warning the next COP global summit might fail to reach a deal on phasing out coal and gas. The government scraps a vote on planning rules after dozens of Conservative MPs publicly threaten to rebel as they try to protect greenfield sites. And developing a green future as the Redcar blast furnace makes way for one of the UK's first carbon capture and storage sites. Hello and welcome to the Daily Climate Show, where we track the changes to our world and interrogate some of the potential solutions to the climate crisis. Now, environmental campaigners and think tanks say they are concerned about the prospects for a deal on fossil fuels at the COP28 Climate Change Summit. One of the biggest issues under discussion is how much help is needed for small and developing nations to adopt renewable energy. Despite calls for an international deal to speed up that transition, there was no agreement in Sharm el-Sheikh, and now there's concern there might also be no deal at COP28, which is due to take place in the United Arab Emirates in a year's time. So let's speak to Alden Mayer, who's a senior associate at the E3G environmental think tank. Alden, thank you so much for talking to us. So one of the big things that came out of COP27 was the number of oil lobbyists. Just how many more were they at COP27 than at COP26, and why is that an issue?
Well, there were over 600 fossil fuel industry representatives, according to NGOs that were tracking this. That was up from COP26. And of course, they were not there to advance climate action and cut emissions and get us off of fossil fuels. Far from that, they were there to block language in the text that would do that, as well as to make trade deals around the side, particularly trade deals between African countries and Europe, to try to accelerate export of natural gas to displace Russian gas.
A lot of people have said that they are concerned about the influence that oil-producing countries are having on these talks. Just how concerned are you about that, and how much of an influence do they actually have?
Well, they've had an influence since the beginning of this process in 1991. The Saudis, the Kuwaitis, Iran, and others have done everything they could to block action on climate change. Matter of fact, in Glasgow last year at COP26, it was the first time that any fossil fuel had been formally mentioned in a COP decision as needing to be phased down. And of course, that was restricted to coal. The oil and gas lobby kept that from being expanded to include gas and oil as well.
Is this problem, do you think, the fact that COP is a UN summit, and so we look at COP and see the influence they may have, and it's just a reflection that they have at the UN?
Well, the COP has some good attributes. It's the only forum where the vulnerable countries, the least developed countries, other smaller countries really get a seat at the table and can use their moral influence. But of course, the Saudis and Kuwaitis, since the beginning 30 years ago, have blocked any decision on supermajority voting in the process. So it requires consensus, which gives them and a handful of others the ability to block progress. A lot of action is happening outside the COP in the G20 and the Clean Energy Ministerial and other spaces. That gives me some hope. But the fossil fuel countries and lobbyists do exercise disproportionate power within the UN system.
If you're looking at geography, geopolitics, where this COP is, a lot of people are saying, OK, it's going to be in the UAE. That's a huge Gulf petrostate. But COP26, COP27, 27 was at Sharm el-Sheikh. A lot of these oil-producing companies were there. There wasn't much change in what was said. Is it down to the geography, or is it down to the influence? Do you think it's unfair, I suppose is what I'm asking, for people to say where it is a problem?
Well, it's both. I mean, it's obviously the influence of the fossil fuel industries in countries around the world in the run-up to these annual COPs that influences their position. But the presidency does matter. The Egyptian presidency worked overtime to keep the option of expanding coal phase down to include oil and gas out of the cover decision in Sharm el-Sheikh. I think the UAE may have learned from that not to be as untransparent as the Egyptians were. And the UAE, of course, hosts the International Renewable Energy Agency. So it's open to clean energy sources. But the king of the UAE did say the beginning of the first week at the COP that they intend to keep producing oil and gas as long as there's demand for it. So we'll see how they play.
The King of
Hopefully they
Saudi.
will do a better job. The king of UAE,
Oh, the
the
president.
head of
Okay,
the
the ruler.
UAE,
Yeah,
and
the ruler. But
yeah,
if
and his
you look at the
intervention.
UAE and Saudi, I mean, they are putting a lot of money into sustainability, into working to combat climate change. They probably would say that that is quite an unfair representation of what they're going to do at COP28 and what they're trying to do in general.
Well, they have made some progress in recent years on expanding support for clean energy technologies. Of course, they talk a lot about carbon capture and storage, which would allow them to keep exporting fossil fuels. It's not really an economically viable technology for large scale use. The real question is they have been trying to block any push to phase down production and use of oil, gas, and coal, as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we have to do if we're going to have any chance of coming close to the 1.5 Celsius temperature limit.
Okay, Alden, thank you so much for talking to us.
Good to be with you.
Thanks. Now, the government has postponed a major vote on plans to build more houses after Conservative backbenchers threatened a large rebellion. More than 40 Tory MPs signed an amendment to the Levelling Up Bill, which would make it easier for councils to ban building on greenfield land and provide more incentives to develop brownfield sites. The former Environment Secretary, Teresa Villiers, has said that without this amendment, the plans would encourage, quote, development which damages the environment and quality of life. Let's speak to our chief political correspondent, John Craig, who joins me now. Hello to you, John. So what are the government's plans? Let's start with that.
Well, the very latest from the government, from a Downing Street spokesperson this afternoon, is that commitment to build no fewer than 300,000 new homes, target by the mid-2020s, that commitment remains, says Downing Street. They say that we want to build more homes in the right places, and yet the government has retreated following the threat of a major rebellion by up to 50 Conservative MPs. Now, Teresa Villiers, a former cabinet minister, tabled a new clause to Mr. Gove, Michael Gove's flagship bill, the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. And her new clause proposed that target of 300,000 may only be advisory, not mandatory. She was backed by all sorts of senior Tory MPs. John Redwood, Maria Miller, Damien Green, Chris Grayling, Priti Patel, Esther McVeigh, a clutch of cabinet ministers there. So, whilst the government appears to be in retreat over a vote that was due to take place next Monday, Downing Street is now saying they remain committed to that target of 300,000. Incidentally, over the past year, the government's only built 172,000, so way short of that.
OK, John, thank you so much. Well, also making the news today, work on what could be one of Britain's biggest climate change projects has taken another step forward. The 365-foot-tall blast furnace at Redcar Steelworks was demolished early this morning. The site will now be used for the Net Zero Teesside project, which aims to build one of the UK's first large-scale carbon capture and storage facilities, taking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere and locking them underground. Thames Water have announced the hosepipe ban imposed on 15 million people in England is being lifted after 3 months. The company says the recent rainfall and the public's compliance are reasons for removing the ban. The restrictions came into effect on August the 24th after a drought was officially declared across most of England following the driest July for 50 years. Paris is considering a ban on electric scooters after concerns around pedestrian safety and questions over their environmental credentials. It was the first city in Europe to open up the scooter hire market 4 years ago. It has about 15,000 of them for hire, and one councillor has said the vehicles have turned Paris into a, quote, jungle. And more than half of the gas lamps in London's West End will be saved after a change of hearts by local officials. Westminster Council had proposed to convert 174 street lamps from gas to the more environmentally friendly LED. Heritage campaigners say the proposals do not go far enough and claim they are still fearful about the lamp's future. Now, if you have a question about climate change that you want to be answered, Send them all via this QR code on the screen, and we will try to answer as many as possible on The Climate Show with Tom Heap at the weekend. And just a reminder, you can watch Tom's show on Saturdays and Sundays. It's at 3:30 in the afternoon and then again at 7:30 in the evening. But from me, Kimberly Leonard, thanks for watching for now, and I'll see you tomorrow.